You've asked me today to talk about models of disability, but what I really want to talk about is one of my favourite movies, Monty Python's The Life of Brian. You may remember all sorts of good jokes and at least one really good song, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, from that film. But I wonder if you also remember John Cleese as a representative of the Popular Front of Judea, or was it the Judean People's Front, asking that eternal question, what have the Romans ever done for us? Keep that question in mind because there are many things which our model of disability has to do. You can see in my overextended mixed metaphor of an analogy that the model of disability plays the part of the Romans. First, our model of disability has to enable us to understand the complexity of disability. Obviously, that will keep us academics happy. We like complexity. I've been working on disability for more than 30 years. I've studied all the different approaches, heard every argument, read most of the evidence at national and global scale. If it was a simple matter, I think I'd have come across it by now. Of course, disability is complicated. Think about congenital disability, acquired disability, disability associated with aging. Think about visible and invisible disability. Think about permanent and episodic disability. Think about physical, sensory, intellectual disability, plus mental health conditions and chronic illness. But disability is not just complicated. An internal combustion engine is complicated. It's got lots of different parts that have to work together. Latin is complicated because of tenses and nouns and verbs having to agree with each other, as in Romani ite domum rather than Romani eant domus, as John Cleese, as a centurion this time, points out to Graham Chapman in The Life of Brian. Disability is not just complicated, it's also complex because it's unpredictable. It's an interaction which works differently for different people at different times and in different places. For this reason, we could think of disability as a wicked problem. And by wicked problems, we mean the solution depends on how the problem is framed, and vice versa. Think of what is disability? Well, it's how you count it, describe it, define it. Secondly, it's wicked because of the stakeholders. Disabled people, families of disabled people, policymakers, professionals, academics, all have radically different worldviews and different frames for understanding the problem of disability. Disability is wicked because the problem of disability is subject to constraints, the resources needed to solve it change over time, and finally, the problem is never solved definitively. So, this will have to do for now for a solution to that wicked, complicated, complex problem. I think you'll agree with me that we cannot be reductionist about disability. Historically, the reductionism was about medicine. Disability was reduced to the medical. But it'd be wrong also to be reductionist to the social. It's not just social or cultural or psychological, because disability is multifactorial. It involves medical and environmental and psychological and social factors. Disability is certainly very complex, very complicated, and as a social scientist, I want everybody to understand that. Otherwise, where would I get my salary from? But in order to make things change and improve for people who live with impairments, it doesn't help to tell audiences that everything's complicated or complex. I remember when I was at WHO, I had the job of explaining to some important people all about disability. What are you going to say? Asked my chief. Well, I said, I thought I'd first explain how complex disability is. Let me stop you right there, said the chief. Never tell a policymaker how complicated anything is. If it's complicated, it will be difficult to change anything. And policymakers want to know that things are simple, that there is an answer, and they can make a difference. So people who live in the real world, as opposed to the ivory tower, need to know they can do something about a problem. But if I'm right that disability is multifactorial, we'll need lots of different people to work together. And that's true in the world of policy. We need the right anti-discrimination laws, inclusive education policies, building codes for accessibility, transport policies, also accessibility. But it's also true in the world of practice. We need the right clinicians, allied health professionals, doctors, nurses, therapists, psychologists, social workers, and indeed families. Everyone has to be able to work together. Policy and practice only succeeds if everyone can work with each other and understand that disability isn't owned by doctors or rehabilitation therapists or even families, but is bigger than all of us and can only be solved by all of us working together. So any conceptualization of disability has to be able to underpin effective interdisciplinary working. Thirdly, a model of disability has to allow children and adults with disabilities to feel good about themselves. You can see why this is so important. We want people with disabilities to feel part of society and to be able to get education and jobs and partners and the good life that everyone aspires to. And in order to achieve that, it helps if people with disabilities don't start from thinking that they're the problem, that they need charity in order to survive, and that adjusting to their needs is a nuisance. We don't want people with disabilities settling for institutional care, or bossy doctors, or patronising parents. We want them to demand their rights and expect the best. Only if they get the best can they interact with other people on equal terms. And that's what the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is all about. It's not about special needs. We have the same needs as everyone else. We need health and education, employment and housing and social protection. The only special thing about this is that these ordinary needs are not ordinarily met. The Convention is all about human rights, not just disability rights, because we are human beings like everyone else. And we need to have that positive sense of identity. We need to feel good about ourselves, have assertiveness and pride in ourselves if we're going to get anywhere. And to build a positive sense of identity, persons with disabilities have to know that the wider environment is often our biggest problem. It's lack of access, lack of transport, lack of good services, lack of opportunities which holds us back, not our impairments. And while you can rarely completely cure an impairment, you can almost always remove many of the barriers in society. Think of the difference that assistive technology makes, or an accessible metro system, or houses that you can wheel into, or sign language everywhere that you need it. If we understand that disability is always about the environment, we will not blame ourselves. We will not feel bad about being different. We will have the power to demand social change. A model of disability has to be about the added barriers that society places in our way and has to enable people with disabilities to feel good about themselves. That's why the social model of disability has proved so powerful, because it makes disabled people feel good about themselves because they've relocated disability from the individual to the environment. Perhaps you can now see why I've referred you originally to the life of Brian, because the answer that John Cleese's character gives goes something like this. All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a freshwater system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? I want to say that a successful conceptualization of disability has to be able to account for the complexity of disability and therefore keep us academics happy, enable effective interdisciplinary working and therefore keep policymakers and practitioners like you happy, and thirdly, underpin a successful disability identity and therefore enable children and adults with disabilities to grow a strong and empowered sense of self and agency and demand their rights for themselves. So we need to meet at least these three different functions. But they're not necessarily very compatible. Remember what I said, if we have a very complex or complicated model, it will make it difficult to achieve practical change. If we have a model that locates the problems in limitations of brain or body, it will not underpin effective advocacy. But if we have a very reductionist model, there will be so many exceptions that no proper academic theorist would support it. As Albert Einstein said, make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. So what are the three approaches which might help us begin to meet those needs? Firstly, there's an over-medicalised approach which starts in the impairment. I think that when we talk about the medical model, we're really setting up a straw person, so I won't use that phrase. For me, it's misleading shorthand. But we certainly have over-medicalisation. And perhaps today we could talk about the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning Disability in Health, because that's the latest version of the WHO approach published in 2001. And I think the ICF is often good for clinicians because it talks about functioning, it connects well to the underlying health condition as described by the International Classification of Disease, and there's space for occupational therapists, physiotherapists and all the rest of it to measure change in the ICF. Secondly, there is a socialised approach which starts in the disabling barriers. I think that's what you're expecting me to talk about. We usually call it the social model. I think it suits the disability movement best because it underpins disability as social identity. It's about barriers. And thirdly, there is a critical realist approach which makes space for both the health condition and the social barriers interacting. And we call this a laminated model, though Nick Watson and I are looking for a better description, otherwise it'll never catch on. So firstly, what are the drawbacks of the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health? Remember, this was a reaction to the disability rights movement. And unlike the International Classification of Impairment, Disability and Handicap, which preceded it, the ICIDH, and was itself actually an attempt to show how disability was social, so ICIDH was progress, but the ICF now pays particular attention to the environment, which is great. We want that. Remember, in the ICF, a health condition interacts with personal factors and environmental factors to produce disability. So disability is personal factors, environmental factors, and the health condition. A health condition in the ICF leads to impairment, but disability isn't really defined as it's any or all of these three things. an impairment of body functional structure, an activity limitation, or a participation restriction. For me, the problem with the ICF is that it attempts to make a very complex situation more straightforward than perhaps it can be. And for example, in the ICF, there's no clear distinction between activity limitations and participation restrictions. So that's a problem. We're not really clear what is to do with the functioning of the body and what's to do with the functioning of society. Now, it might be that's necessary, because if you draw sharp distinctions, they're probably wrong, but it certainly complicates what should be a straightforward model. The ICF takes a universal approach. That means that everybody is at risk of impairment. It doesn't distinguish between disabled and non-disabled people. But actually, we do need to distinguish between people with disabilities and people who are non-disabled. After all, as Vic Finkelstein sarcastically said, if we are people with disabilities, what does that make everyone else? People with abilities? And while the environment does play a key role, is that enough? Surely the environment, the social, cultural meaning, is central. After all, the definition of what counts as a disability and what isn't is itself also social. And if you don't believe me, think about it. If I missed one joint, say, of my little finger, my life wouldn't be very impaired. I can still type, I can still tell jokes and give talks. If I was a concert pianist or a violinist, it'd be a major problem. So you're disabled depending on what you're expected to do and within a particular society. The levels of hypertension, blood pressure in Western societies are not normal. They're too inflated. But that is normal because it's what everybody has. They are pathological, but on average, that's what we have. Same with obesity and overweight in America and British society. The common situation is not the good situation. So what we count as disability depends on the context in which we are thinking. So let's thirdly turn to the social model. And the origins of this lie in the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, a British group, in about 1976. They were a radical Marxist group. They were a sort of self-help group of disabled people. And they were trying to distinguish themselves from charities and academics like Peter Townsend in the Disability Alliance. And they were also trying to address the exclusion of disabled people, but they were very much from the top down. They thought if they got the evidence, they'd persuade Parliament to change the law. In fact, in the 1960s and 70s, many activists and academics were trying to solve the problem of disability. It wasn't just the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS. Remember books like Handicapping America by Frank Bowe in 1978. The events shown in the wonderful Netflix documentary, really recommend it, Crip Camp, you can see a young Judy Human, which led to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, and eventually the 1991 Americans with Disabilities Act. Even in Britain, it wasn't just UPIAS. It was also the Liberation Network of People with Disabilities and Sisters Against Disablement and GEMMA and many other groups of activists who are working from the bottom up. The UPIAS tendency and the UK's social model won out over many of these different approaches because UPIAS were a Leninist group, and Leninists always win any radical battles, whether it's 1917 in Russia or 1981 at the Disabled People's International. And then Mike Oliver came along in the 1980s, his paper in 1983, for example, but particularly his 1990 book, The Politics of Disablement, to put the social model into academic language. And it's he that came up with this term, the social model of disability. And although the social model is certainly based in a barriers approach, we are disabled by society, not by our bodies, is sort of a slogan way of putting it, I would suggest that this political identity of disabled people is actually as much about a minority group model as a social model. What's the minority group model? Well, it's very strong in the United States, thanks to the work of Holland Hahn, 1988, and the civil rights tradition. The idea of people with disabilities as an oppressed minority who need their civil rights is very strong. So we have an American tradition based in the minority group model, but with a strong social model element, barriers element. And we have the UK tradition based in the social model, but having a strong minority group undercurrent. And you could say that both these come together in the 2006 Convention on the Rights of People with Persons with Disabilities, because it takes a barriers approach. Over and again, it talks about exclusion, but it's clear that the category of disability, and here I quote, includes those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So, impairments in interaction with barriers. But there is a group of people who are protected by the convention. Both the social model and the minority group model are very good at building a strong disability identity. And you can see that in the strong global movement of disabled people. Even though, actually, our research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine finds that less than 10% of disabled people are actually members of organisations of persons with disabilities. So these models, the social model, the minority group model, are very good at disentangling the individual's impairment, on the one hand, from the social exclusion, usually called the disability, which constitutes the main obstacle to their participation. Both these approaches, the social model, the minority group model, are very good at identifying barriers, at promoting reasonable accommodation and independent living and inclusive education, and all the other things that make life better for children and adults with disability. And I really advise you, if you haven't done already, to look at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Mike Oliver has said of the social model that it's like a very effective tool. He loved American labor movement songs, Woody Guthrie and all the rest of it. So he used to use the song, "If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this world." Forgive my singing. But you get the impression, you remember the song. And Mike used to say that the social model was the disability movement's hammer, the tool that could remove barriers. And when I heard him say that, my answer was immediate and obvious. Because, as you know, in English there's also a familiar proverb, if you give a person a hammer, all he sees is nails. In other words, not all difficulties can be solved with one tool. The tradie needs a hammer and a saw and a bradawl and a winch and all the rest of it, a wrench and all the rest of it. Not all difficulties can be solved with a hammer. The social model is part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer. And in our work, my colleague Nick Watson and I have tried to say about the social model that he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. Another reference to Life of Brian. The social model has been very powerful, but I don't think it's the ultimate answer. That's why we say it's not the Messiah. The reason for this is because the social model fails to account for impairment. Yet, disabled people ourselves know that impairment has a strong impact on our lives. It's not a mere difference, as philosopher Elizabeth Barnes wants us to think. For example, in the 2009 Social Attitudes Survey in the UK, both disabled and non-disabled people thought that both barriers and impairment were responsible for the difficulties faced by persons with disabilities. And really, this is obvious. If you talk to any disabled person, this is what they say. When you do qualitative research, like Nick Watson and myself, that's what people say about their lives. They say, well, it's a real problem, I can't do this, or I'm at risk of pressure sores, or I have bladder infections, or I have pain, And I hate the fact that the transport system is not accessible and my house is not accessible, all the rest of it. It's both. After all, I don't think anybody wants impairment. We're not neutral about it, as we would be if it's really a mere difference. We think, all of us think, impairment is generally negative. We don't want it to happen, we don't want it to get worse, we wouldn't welcome new impairments. That's why, as clinicians, we try to cure it or reduce it wherever possible. And that's a good thing. We want to give pregnant women folic acid to reduce the incidence of spina bifida. We want births to go well so that babies don't have cerebral palsy. We don't want cancer to lead to paralysis. We don't want children or adults to have accidents, look both ways before you cross the roads, or become blind because of measles or other infectious disease. We want to provide access to rehabilitation and assistive devices to minimize the impact that impairment has when you have it. We want medicine. We're not opposed to medicine. And here I think we can make a very important distinction. As I've said, impairment is generally negative. We don't welcome it. We want to avoid it. We want to prevent it or cure it. But lives of people with impairment can be very good. Sometimes even better than those of non-disabled people, perhaps because we have a sense of proportion, a good sense of perspective. And this paradox must be very hard to grasp because it escapes many people. Just because we're arguing that it's okay to be a disabled person doesn't have to mean that impairment is good. Just because we're arguing that impairment is generally a restriction or at the least a predicament, as I said in my 2006 book, Disability Rights and Wrongs, it doesn't mean that disabled people are inferior to everyone else. We certainly don't want medicine at all costs or to be subordinated to clinicians. A cure isn't always the answer. Impairment, not good. Disabled people, very good lives. That's what the evidence says. I think, actually, if you want to be metaphysical about this, I think impairment is the side effect of embodiment. To be alive, to have a body or a mind, is to be at risk of impairment. Our health fails all the time. Think about getting a cold or COVID or a twisted ankle or a skiing injury. Most of us have some degree of impairment. If you play footy, you have knackered knees or other joints. If you play golf, you probably have a bad back, or you're a bowler in cricket, you have a bad back. All of us will become more impaired as we get older. And normally, and I can say this myself, by the time you reach your 50s, you've said goodbye to your hair, or your fertility, your teeth, or your jogging, your complexion, or your hips. Everyone is at risk of impairment. Sorry about the bad news. Death is just the moment when you've accumulated so many impairments that you give up the ghost. Sorry to get you down, but it's the truth. I even suspect that the reason the world is so hostile to disabled people may be that we remind everyone else of that fact. We're the people who didn't escape impairment. You're the people who pretend that it's nothing to do with you. Well, it is. You're going to have more of it, and finally, that's it. So, I've said that the ICF may enable interdisciplinary working, but it's too simplistic. I've said that the social model may empower a strong disability identity, but it's too reductionist and anti-medical. So what do I want? Am I ever satisfied? I don't want to make you anxious and be all academic on you, but I think the solution to disability may lie in critical realism. I don't want you to have to go and read lots of philosophy in order to understand disability. In a short keynote, I just want to emphasize that disability is an interaction. With my colleague Nick Watson and inspired by Roy Bhaskar and Bert Danemark in their paper from 2006, I think we have to take a necessarily laminar approach. Laminate is like laminated, it's like plywood basically, it's layers. And that's the third way, if you like. Neither medical nor social, but both, and lots more beside. A laminar approach would say that different levels make up the complexity of disability. And it'd be wrong to reduce disability either to biological difference or to environmental factors or psychological factors or social factors. Disability works at different levels. The biological level, the psychological level, the environmental level, and the social level. Disability is the interaction of the different levels in different contexts. And each level, in my way of thinking, contains different layers. So the bottom level, the biological level, has the molecular biology, the body systems, the rehabilitation. The social level has culture, law and policy, but also basic human social interactions with our neighbours or our family. And you can describe a person at different points, different layers of this laminated reality. They might all be perfectly accurate. They coexist. For example, I have a G to A transposition of 0.38 to my FGFR3 gene. G to A transposition of 0.38 to my FGFR3 gene. And that's a correct genetic description of my condition, achondroplasia. It's a molecular biology approach, but it doesn't tell you much about me. You don't have to take into account my gender, my age, my class, my country, in order to understand me fully. And each of us, all of us, have these interacting realities. Lower levels influence higher levels, but you can't reduce social complexity to that biology. Otherwise, I could turn to this audience and say, many of you have got XX syndrome. And that's why you are subordinate in society. That's why people don't listen to you. That's why you're paid less. Well, that's nonsense. XX is just a genetic description of being a woman. That's not the reason that you may have a pay gap or not be listened to, whatever. That's social. That's cultural, not biological. And we can reduce disability by making changes at the biological, psychological, environmental, or social levels. We can intervene as doctors, therapists, wheelchair engineers, counsellors, architects, lawyers, and disability activists. We can make better films, better buildings, better laws, better orthotics, better surgery, a better gene therapy. Some interventions will be more appropriate, acceptable, and value for money than others. I would rather move the light switch so I can reach it than extend my legs in a surgical procedure. I would rather outlaw discrimination against disabled people than eliminate disabled people. So for much of the time, the social model actually works just fine. Let's remove the barriers. But it's not right for advocates to turn against medicine or rehabilitation or deny our right to be frustrated about impairment. After all, it hurts. It's a problem. It kills us sometimes. Often, it's when impairment causes pain that a predicament becomes a problem. And that's what the European Sparkle project, with I think 500 children with cerebral palsy, found. Quality of life of children with cerebral palsy was equivalent to non-disabled people, except when they were experiencing pain. So, I think we have to maximize function and reduce the impact of a health condition. And I turn to rehabilitation specialists and a pain clinic to tell me how to achieve that. I think we have to get the best possible assistive technologies, my wheelchair and my orthotics, and enabling environments, my flat, my bus, for people with disabilities. And I think we have to expect disabled people to be welcome in all the settings that non-disabled people are, from schools and colleges to workplaces and restaurants and theatres, and we have to ensure that our anti-discrimination law guarantees that. And I think also we have to work at the individual level so that people with disabilities, children with disabilities, feel good about themselves, not special, but equal to anyone else and deserving of a seat at the table. which may take some good psychological intervention, whether from parents or therapists. And remember, blessed are the cheesemakers. Thank you very much.